Good afternoon and welcome to our virtual town hall with Dr. Carol Fenton, the Medical Health Officer for Interior Health located in Kamloops. My name is Matt Milovic and I'm the Vice President of Administration and Finance at TRU. So a little bit of housekeeping off the top before we get going. We will be recording today's town hall and posting a video Q&A on our website for those not able to join us at this time for viewing at a later date. As I've done before, I will act as moderator and we'll use the bulk of our time to ask those questions that are specifically in the purview of our medical health officer. And if there's time at the end, I'll answer questions that specifically relate to TRU. We scheduled this town hall purposefully a few weeks after the release of the provincial return to campus guidelines to answer any questions that faculty, staff, or students may have about the fall and the lead up to the start of the fall term. If you've had a chance to compare the Go Forward Guidelines primer that was released in the spring to the return to campus guidelines, you'll have noticed that many of the restrictions that we were contemplating in the spring have fallen away as we fully align the return to campus guidelines with the BC Restart Plan that was released in late May. Throughout the pandemic, and when I say we, I mean the entire post-secondary sector, has worked with the Provincial Health Office to ensure their institutions are safe and that the anticipated resumption of in-person learning on our campuses this fall will continue to be safe. I personally cannot thank the Provincial Health Office enough for their collaboration throughout this process and throughout the pandemic. In all my years working in post-secondary education, I've never experienced a time when every single institution in the province has galvanized around a common direction, which is what we've seen throughout the pandemic from the release of the first edition of the Go Forward Guidelines, culminating in the Return to Campus Guidelines. And for this, I have to give credit to the Provincial Health Office for their steady and pragmatic advice. We've also received quite a bit of recognition nationally for the BC approach to our campus restart plan. I'm sure many of you have viewed the town halls with Dr. Bonnie Henry that TRU hosted for labor groups and for students in the late spring. And I know that Dr. Henry's remarks went a long way to reducing some of the anxiety associated with the return to campus and the general trajectory of the pandemic and vaccinations. Many of you will remember that we had Dr. Fenton join us for a town hall in the fall, which is extremely beneficial to our campus as we began to navigate our way through the fall term amidst the pandemic. So with that, I'll turn to Dr. Fenton to introduce herself and say a few words, and then we'll jump right into questions. Dr. Fenton.
Great, thanks so much for having me. So as mentioned, I'm Dr. Carol Fenton. I'm a medical health officer with Interior Health located in Kamloops. And what that means is that I am a public health and preventive medicine specialist physician working for Interior Health Authority. And I've been busy with my colleagues for the past 16 months to help manage this pandemic. So I'm happy to be here and to answer your questions.
Right on. So let's, why don't we jump right into the questions? We have a bunch. Themes are mostly around international students and vaccinations. We'll start with one related to international students. So what do international students do if they've been fully vaccinated in their home country with an approved vaccine that is not one of the 4 used in Canada?
So here in BC, we are recognizing any WHO approved vaccination. So if you've received a full series of any of those WHO approved vaccines, you do not need to be revaccinated and you're considered fully immunized. If you are not fully vaccinated or you received one that's not on that WHO approved list, then you are eligible to receive one of the vaccines that we are providing in Canada.
Excellent. Here's another one that's related. Can international students be allowed to be vaccinated if they are tested negative during the quarantine period?
So from a medical perspective, the only people who are not eligible for the vaccine are someone who has an anaphylactic allergy to the vaccine or any of its components, and anyone who actively has symptoms with COVID positive infection. So that's from the medical perspective. So if someone has no symptoms and they tested negative, then medically they're eligible. Logistically, if someone is self-isolating or they test positive and they're self-isolating because of that, it could be more difficult to get that vaccine in that period, but medically speaking, it's safe to receive.
Excellent. Okay. I'm going to ask you to look into the crystal ball a little bit here. Do you anticipate the Provincial Health Office recommending a 3rd COVID booster in the fall?
So I'm receiving a lot of these questions around, will we need a booster? How long will the immunity last? And at this point, we don't know because it's a new vaccine. It's only been around for about a year. And so we don't know yet if that immunity is going to wane. There have been the pharmaceutical companies are saying that they've done studies that have shown that a third dose increases the antibodies. But to me, that just says that the body's ability to create those antibodies was still there. So it's not proof to me that that third dose is needed. And so what we're doing at the provincial level is we're watching to see the patterns of vaccination and infection in those who are vaccinated. And if that pattern changes and indicates to us that the vaccine isn't as effective anymore, that's better evidence. So we're watching that closely, and if that is a recommendation that emerges, I'm sure it will be announced publicly.
Excellent. Okay, so we'll watch that space. The next question relates to masks, and this is a question that's been asked over and over again. The question is, will mask wearing in classrooms be mandatory or recommended? I'll answer it from the perspective of the return to campus guidelines, and Dr. Fenton, if you have anything more to add, feel free. But basically, right now, as of the fall, masks will not be mandatory in classrooms or public spaces. Technically, they're not mandatory right now. At TRU, we've continued to mandate masks in our common areas and public spaces and in our buildings, except in workspaces, and we will do that just through to complete the summer term. But as of August, masks will no longer be required. Dr. Fenton, is there anything you'd like to add on that one?
And your masks have been a useful tool in controlling this pandemic, but the best tool in our toolkit is that vaccine. And so as long as we maintain a high proportion of vaccinated folks around us, the masks won't be necessary. But from a public health perspective, we will be monitoring the patterns, and if anything changes, the guidance will change.
Excellent. Okay, and we'll be looking for that, and hopefully it doesn't change. Here's a question related to medical insurance. The question is verbatim: what all facilities are covered in the medical insurance of the province of BC?
So BC's publicly funded healthcare that comes with your PHN covers physicians and hospital visits. And then usually students will have a student plan that will cover other things like drugs and other benefits.
Right, exactly, and our students definitely do have that. Here's a question about self-isolation. What will the self-isolation requirements be for someone who has COVID-19 symptoms? And what about for someone who has tested positive?
So the recommendations are, if anyone has COVID-19 compatible symptoms, it's really, really important to self-isolate. So monitor yourself for these symptoms. If you have them, self-isolate and seek testing. If the test is negative, it's still a good idea to stay away from others while you're symptomatic, because you could have some other infection that would be rude to pass it around. But it's more of a politeness at that point. And so, and I'm hoping that'll be a change that's permanent in society, that we will stay away from others when we are symptomatic.
Okay, and just to follow up on the second part about that question, what about for someone who has tested positive?
So anyone who has tested positive as a resident of BC will be contacted by one of our communicable disease specialists. They conduct an interview to find out what were the symptoms, when was the symptom onset, and who has everyone been in contact with, and they will determine, they will let that person know specifically for how long they have to self-isolate, and then they will also contact those who may have been exposed and then give those people specific instructions as well.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to jump to a question about a potential outbreak on campus, and we're optimistic that won't happen, but it might. But if there is an outbreak on campus, how will that be handled by the Provincial Health Office?
So it's not the Provincial Health Office that would manage that outbreak. It would be an MHO like myself with Interior Health. We would work closely with the communicable disease specialists that have information about the cases. And so what happens is the MHO who's on call, which might be myself or one of my colleagues, will declare an outbreak, and then we will have meetings and determine what is needed to get the situation under control. So it is very context specific, but we are trained to do this, and we've been doing it for 16 months.
Right, and I think that's the difference, is that nothing really has changed, that your role will still be the same and the university's role will still be the same in those circumstances.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, great. Even after people recover from COVID, how likely will they have long-term effects, and how long do they last? What are impacts to health and well-being afterwards?
I don't think this is yet well understood. We know that there is a small percentage of folks that do have what is colloquially known as long COVID. So they'll have symptoms that persist. They might have fatigue, they might have breathing difficulties. We know that the virus can affect some of our vascular or cardiac cells as well. But this is going to be something that we learn about over the long term. And it's just another reason why protecting ourselves and those around us with vaccination is really, really important.
Okay, and here's a question that's particularly timely given what's going on in the province. Do folks with chronic lung conditions have an increased chance of contracting COVID during wildfires, since we know smoke can exacerbate lung problems? Are there extra measures that should be taken?
So the state of health of someone's lungs doesn't change the likelihood of whether or not they will be infected with COVID. That has more to do with what environments you're in, who you're coming into contact with, and whether or not there are prevention measures in place. But it will determine what happens once that infection occurs. And so we do know that people who have conditions like lung conditions, heart conditions, and other health conditions are more likely to become severely ill and hospitalized with COVID. And so, it's really important to get vaccinated and practice those prevention recommendations as public health makes them. So stay tuned to those recommendations. And then in terms of the smoke, it's always good to pay attention to the Air Quality Health Index. So most of the weather platforms display this as an option. And that Air Quality Health Index will be a number from 1 to 10 to tell you how bad the smoke is. And then that number will come with specific recommendations. And so right now in Kamloops, it's really, really smoky. And so in general, we would recommend people don't exercise outside. They avoid working outside for long periods of time, and if they're having difficulty breathing, they should seek health care.
Great. Here's a question about the variants. Of course, we're hearing a lot about the Delta variant and more recently I think it's the Lambda variant. But how effective have the vaccines been at protecting against variants?
So, I mean, this is very difficult to evaluate in BC because the vaccines combined with the rest of our public health measures have been very effective, and now our infection rates are very low, which is good. That indicates that the vaccines are working and they're doing their job. But to really evaluate how effective a vaccine is, you need a high rate of infection. So, we look globally and we see some areas like, the UK and some areas in Europe where they're seeing more infections, but it's really hard to tease apart how much of that is vaccine, how much of that is unvaccinated people, and how much of that is a lack of other preventive measures, because these are, complex things. So what I will say is, so far, it appears that the vaccine is working very well. But the most important thing that we can do to continue that effectiveness is get as many people as possible, both locally and globally, vaccinated, so the virus doesn't continue to replicate and mutate.
Okay. And here's a question about children under 12 years of age. So the question is, why haven't children under 12 been eligible for the vaccines? Is it unknown long-term risk or side effects, dosage adjustments needed? Children seem more resistant.
It is because for regulatory approval, which is a very rigorous and thorough process in Canada, they require controlled trials specifically in those populations to look for those effects, so to make sure that we know beyond question that it is safe. And so the pharmaceutical companies are doing those trials and they're going through those regulatory steps, but they cannot be rushed. And so we just have to make sure that we protect those who are unvaccinated by vaccinating everyone who is eligible and continuing to practice our prevention while we wait.
Okay, and here's a question again, just going back to the variants. It's two parts. The first part of the question is, what do researchers know about the variants and how they're created or their origins? And are people who don't get vaccinated or take precautions accelerating viral mutation?
So answer the second one first and then the first one. So yes, so exactly, the variants emerge when when viruses replicate, they make a copy of their DNA, and every so often these copies of DNA will have an error in them because they're just copying them very fast. And there are some viruses that have a really high rate of these errors, like HIV, which is why HIV is always mutating, and we don't have a vaccine for HIV. COVID doesn't appear to mutate that quickly, but if there's enough COVID circulating and enough COVID replicating in people who have been infected to create enough of these errors, that a variant emerges. And so the best thing we can do to prevent the development of the variants is to prevent the spread and infection of COVID. And so one of the best ways we have to do that is the vaccine, and then the other public health prevention measures as well.
Excellent. Okay, great. Should TRU consider rapid testing for faculty, staff, and students, and if so, under what circumstances?
So from a public health perspective, and I can only speak to interior health operations, and we're only implementing rapid testing in areas where the PCR testing, so that's the lab test, only where the lab test is not available, because the rapid tests are less accurate than the lab test. And so in remote communities and First Nation communities where transporting a swab to the lab and getting that back there can take days sometimes, rapid testing is a great innovation, and we're really glad to have it. For other settings where, like in Kamloops, we have a lab right here in Kamloops, and so it's not as difficult to get that testing. Rapid testing is less appealing, and so we're not recommending it.
Okay, great. That's really helpful to know. Here's a question about the vaccination clinic at the TCC, and the question, it's really two. How long will the vaccination clinic be operable at the TCC, and when it ends, where will people be expected to get vaccinated?
That's a really good question, and I don't have an answer, because as we have done for the past 16 months in the pandemic, we roll with the punches and we do what's needed in the moment. And so right now it's really important to keep that clinic operable, because we really still have quite a few folks that need to get vaccinated in that large format. If that were to change, if we get to a really high percentage in Kamloops, or people are just not going to the TCC, we'll have to come up with a different plan. So if that changes, or if things progress to the point that we don't need any special pandemic vaccination, we will roll back and vaccines will be offered through public health, similar to the way we offer testing now.
Excellent. That's great. And I think it's safe to say that that the university would be willing to operate its own vaccination clinic, whether we run it out of our own medical health center or elsewhere, if the need is there. So consider us volunteered for this, Dr. Fenton, if you need us.
Great. I'd love to support that.
Okay. Here's one for you, and this is the last formal question that we have for you, and then I'm going to answer a number of them that are specific to TRU. You're certainly welcome to weigh in on any of those, but the question on this, the question I have for you is this: are you, as a public health professional, satisfied with the BC Restart Plan?
Yes. And, it's quite normal to feel nervous about the walking back of these public health prevention measures. I know I did, even though I have access to more information than most people. And so it is quite normal to feel apprehensive about it. But I do know that, the folks working at the PHO in the Provincial Public Health Officer's office are some of the smartest, most brilliant people that I've ever had the privilege to work with, and they are very risk averse as well. So that gives me confidence that the right thing is happening. And I also know that at the regional level in Interior Health, we continue to monitor very closely the situation, and we have seen through all of the stages of reopening thus far, our cases have continued to decline, and that's really reassuring.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, and I completely agree with you. I'm going to move into some questions that are fairly TRU specific. The first one is: how does TRU define What does TRU define as a common indoor area as outlined in outlaid in the mask requirements? So as I mentioned earlier, while we're not required to have masks in our public spaces according to the BC Restart Plan, we are maintaining that position until the end of July, and after August 1st. Masks will be a personal choice. I think we will likely recommend them, but again, we certainly won't be enforcing it, and it becomes a personal choice. So those common indoor areas, right now, our position is that if you're in a TRU building and not at a workstation, so you're not at your desk or your cubicle, but you're moving around through the building, that we'd ask you to wear a mask. But again, at the end of July, starting in August, that will fall away, and then masks become a personal choice. This next question is not really about COVID. There's a different issue here, but I'm going to answer it anyway. What is TRU doing about overcrowded classrooms for the semesters going forward in a post-pandemic world? It wasn't uncommon to have 50 students in a lab for 20. That's not a COVID problem. That's an occupancy issue, and I hope it is uncommon that we have 50 students in a lab for 20. All I can say is that the labs all have occupancy limits, and we need to be adhering to those. I am certain that we're not scheduling 50 students in a lab that only holds 20. So there's a different issue there, and those are conversations that could be had at the faculty level and or with the Office of Safety and Emergency Management. It's a question related to, it's likely from an international student, but the question is this: how will I know if my designated learning institution has a COVID-19 readiness plan approved? So the answer to that is the federal government publishes the updated list of approved designated learning institutions, of which we are one, and that you will find that TRU has a COVID plan approved by the provincial government of British Columbia, and the province has been pretty good about managing this and monitoring this, and so TRU has been very diligent in its COVID-19 efforts, and we remain on that list. But you can always check our status or the status of other institutions on the province's website. Another question from an international student. It goes like this: I'm an international student currently in my home country, have concerns on traveling back along with financial issues. Shouldn't we be given an alternative? So we understand this unprecedented pandemic has brought many challenges for all of our students, particularly for international students who are facing travel restrictions and visa delays. So yes, we will be providing alternate options for students who are not able to travel to campus due to either travel restrictions or inability to obtain study permits in time to start the fall semester in person. These options include online virtual delivery, deferral to the following semester, and exploring our open learning options. You should be reminded that one of the requirements for international students' study permit is to provide proof of sufficient financial resources to study in Canada without having to work. So if you have some concerns about that, my advice would be to start with your international student advisor at TRU World and have those discussions. Next question, sort of along the same lines: since the course delivery is still blended, couldn't we continue it virtually for the fall semester for those who find it difficult to travel at this time? So TRU is planning to return to campus in-person delivery for the fall semester. We are first and foremost an on-campus university with open learning that has traditionally served our off-campus learning needs. You will need to be on campus even for the very few blended courses, and there will be very few blended courses and very few virtual courses. But once again, if you're not able to travel due to study permit delay and or travel restrictions, contact TRU World and they can explore alternative options for you on a case-by-case basis. So what else do we have? We've almost exhausted all of our questions. In fact, we have exhausted all of our questions. Oh, there is one last one. So the return to campus guidelines move into step 4 on September 7th. How can we expect to shift from step 3 to step 4 overnight? And the answer to that is we view the time from July 1st to September 7th as a transition. And so we will be gradually moving people back to campus, employees back into offices. All the environments are safe. They've been made to be safe, and so there's a little bit of I guess fungibility about some of the very limited restrictions that currently exist in Step 3 to Step 4. So it's not like it's a binary thing that happens that all of a sudden we go from one thing on September 6th to another thing on September 7th. So it will be very much a transition and one that will be managed by the directors, the managers, the AVPs in your areas. So have those discussions with your folks, but we expect that the transition will be safe and orderly. And come September 7th, the goal is that we're essentially back to normal with next to no restrictions. So I think that answers all the questions that had been submitted. So we're about a half hour ahead of schedule, which is fine. But I do want to first and foremost thank Dr. Fenton for being with us today. As always, her contributions and those of her office have been invaluable to TRU. Dr. Fenton, any last words or advice for this group?
I think it just bears repeating that, the best tool in our toolkit at this point in the pandemic is vaccination. It's really important, if you're eligible to get vaccinated and use your power of influence to talk to those around you and ask them, have they been vaccinated, and tell the story of why vaccination is important to you. Be a community vaccine champion for me. Thanks.
Great advice, Dr. Fenton. Finally, I'd like to thank all of our participants for joining us today. I want to wish you all the best for the rest of the summer and for your transition back to campus. Stay safe, as Dr. Fenton said, get vaccinated as you are able. On behalf of our president, Dr. Brett Fairburn, and the entire executive, my thanks. Take care.